United States have stepped in during the 2011 Libyan civil war? Should the United States have stepped in during the 2011 Libyan civil war? Muammar Gaddafi wasn't considered the sanest leader of a sovereign nation. After all, it's kind of hard to take him seriously when he insisted that Al-Qaeda had slipped drugs in people's coffee that made them rebel against his government. And so, interestingly enough, science proved him wrong in time, and he was deposed as dictator of Libya. But by that same token, the Libyan democracy has been fledgling over the past year, attempting to build a semblance of stability in an otherwise sea of authoritarian regimes. And as the United States Institute of Peace explains on August 15th of 2012, so far Libya has done a fairly good job of building up its democracy. And yet policy analysts have instead turned toward another target implicit in the Libyan civil war, the lack of action on the part of the United States. Although the United States certainly implemented a no-fly zone and cast their support for the Libyan revolution, they didn't do much like put boots on the ground or actually any significant military action, prompting several policy analysts to wonder whether or not the United States should have taken a stronger role in determining the outcome of the Libyan civil war, using more decisive and timely action. Considering the importance of Libya in regards to the Middle East, as one of the few nations to undergo a successful democratic transition, it's important that we analyze the United States policies in the region in order to assess the current geopolitical picture, making it essential that we ask today's question. Should the United States have stepped in during the 2011 Libyan civil war? And the answer is absolutely, because it would have not only benefited Libya, but also the United States more. We can look at three key reasons why. First, it would have bolstered the image of the United States to other Middle Eastern nations. Moreover, it would have created a legitimate framework for the United Nations idea of a responsibility to protect. But finally, because it could have served as a deterrence against Islamic forces within Libya. Now, the United States is somewhat self-obsessed with its image, but despite that, after its initial invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, it's seen public support in the Middle East for the United States at an all-time low. And yet, the United States first should have intervened in Libya with more decisive military action, because it would have bolstered its public image to the rest of these Middle Eastern nations. As a Gallup poll from November of 2011 explains, only 11% of people in the entire Middle Eastern regions, including Pakistan, consider the United States a steadfast ally, while 66% consider the terrorists a stabilizing force. Obviously, there is something of an issue with the United States' public image. And as the Council on Foreign Relations explains on August 16th of 2012, this boils down to the fact that the United States hasn't been seen as supporting grassroots Islamic movements. After all, their initial invasion seemed to be toward the United States bolstering its own capitalist philosophy on the otherwise authoritarian Middle Eastern nations. But by that same token, state-owned media, as well as terrorist propaganda, have served to act as a deterrence against a bolstering of the United States public image. As the New York Times explains on September 4th of 2012, the easiest way to solve this would have been more decisive military action where Islamist movements actually wanted it. The Libyan movement was backed by several Arab nations, and decisive military action on the part of the United States couldn't have been spun as a different narrative by terrorist propaganda or state-owned media, because it would have been clear to everyone that the United States was on the force on the side of the people. Essentially, the United States has taken great pains to try to improve its public image, and siding with a movement like the Libyan Revolution more strongly, without any chance of having its narrative be spun by terrorist groups, would have allowed the United States to act with greater efficacy in the Middle Eastern region. But we also have to look at the general realm of geopolitics and see that had the United States acted more decisively within Libya, it could have established a legitimate framework for further interventions into authoritarian regimes. Now, as the Council on Foreign Relations explains in a June of 2012 briefing, one of the key ideas behind the United Nations is a responsibility to protect, a somewhat nebulous provision that says that if an authoritarian regime meets certain thresholds of atrocity, it's the responsibility of the international community, as well as individual nations, to take great pains to protect human liberties. And yet, this nebulous idea has never really come into effect. While the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq seemed to be based on R2P, we saw that this charter actually came about in 2005. So the United States kind of jumped the gun there. Unfortunately, the responsibility to protect hasn't been clearly defined by any nation. Yet, as the Jamestown Institution explains on June 16th of 2012, had the United States intervened in Libya, this would have been a clear, legitimate framework for further intervention. Rather than being confused about the role of the United States in the international community in a lot of these debacles, it would have set a clear framework for how to intervene, when to intervene, and at what level they should. Ultimately, further intervention into Libya would have allowed the United States to establish a legitimate framework for future interventions. But we also have to look at one of the main worries of the United States, that is the role of Islamic movements in burgeoning democracies. And we have to see that had the United States stepped into the Libyan civil war, we wouldn't have such a presence of Islamists within the Libyan government. Now, the General National Congress of Libya has been considered basically free and fair by most international observers. Yet despite this, many Islamists have managed to step in and institute their own role. As the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs explains, on July 5th of 2012, this comes in the idea of spinning narratives against democracy or trying to gather grassroots support against the General National Congress. And while the GNC does look stable for the time being, it's truly hard to get any threat against a burgeoning democracy. Had the United States intervened sooner, as that same Georgetown article explains, we would have actually seen a deterrence against many of these Islamic movements. In fact, had timely action been taken, many of the Libyans simply didn't want to side with the Islamists. They were in it for democracy. Yet the only boots on the ground were the Libyan natives and the Islamic forces. Essentially, had the United States cast their full-fledged support for the Libyan revolution, we could have seen a deterrence in the amount of Islamic forces within the region. So when we come back to today's question, should the United States have stepped in during the 2011 Libyan civil war? We saw that the answer was absolutely, because it would have helped Libya and the United States. First, we saw that it could have helped the United States' public image in the Middle East. Moreover, it could have established a legitimate framework for the responsibility to protect. But finally, because it could have served as a deterrence against further Islamic movements.